So we wanted to spend a few minutes talking about a conversation that the four of us have had over the course of the last couple days about personal sovereignty. So one of our 9 MSLS core leadership practices is about sovereignty, and stepping into sovereignty is a real complex dynamic that we wanted to unpack and dive a little bit deeper into that particular practice of. So Shandine was sharing a little bit more about the word sovereignty and the place where that comes and the multiple meanings that sovereignty can evoke.
And I guess I'm talking about it in the context of why personal sovereignty as a core principle matters, but I can't talk about why it matters as a core principle without thinking about what it means in terms of what a sovereign nation is, what it means to be a sovereign nation, what it means to have an inherent right to be a sovereign nation on this land with the community, with people, with the water, with the earth, with everything around, what it means to have to be your own sovereign as a sovereign nation. And I can't think about personal sovereignty without thinking about what it means to be of a sovereign people, of a sovereign land, of a sovereign nation. And I think sometimes we throw around the word sovereignty. We don't mean to, but I think we use it lightly without remembering what it means to nationhood and to be a part of a larger decolonizing concept. Does that make sense? So when I think about personal sovereignty, all of that is a part of it, not just what we might be referring to in the moment. It's not separate. And I think we're going to come into some tensions with that as we go throughout the year, and I'm sort of excited to talk to students about it, to talk to you all about it as we examine the contours of what sovereignty is.
Word, and it's the power in the way that you've just described it, has a depth that says we're going to make a bridge around the ways we'll put personal in front of a word like sovereignty, which has a tremendous kind of core and depth and sacredness to it. And we want to actually make those connections. So by putting personal in front of it means to begin to bring a state and a practice and to connect or bridge the personal idea of sovereignty to the idea of sovereignty in nationhood or in people, and that might be 2 years worth of learning. And that actually having it there and saying it could actually begin to make a connection between how I might be sovereign within myself or different parts of myself and how that might play out in the world writ large. There's a way it could be used simplistically or too lightly or too quickly, in which we talk about personal sovereignty and we're kind of really saying like I get to do what I want. It's an experience of like agency and personal responsibility, and you use the word license. So part of my own story is around helping create a school that gave young people a commitment to say you get to do a lot of what you want to do, a tremendous amount of freedom in the learning environment. And watching what happens when you give, when we increase the amount of freedom we have, because we have low opportunity to experience that, and it's uneven. This isn't true for everyone. So like different cultures, different communities, different family systems have different amounts of practice, having a lot of agency or having a lot of freedom. But if you are newer to having that, and you're particularly used to an academic environment in which people tell you what to do or how to do it or how the assignment should look, and you're in the habit of either pleasing or conforming or even really rigorously trying to do it, or if it's how you're keeping time or how you prepare, anything that's going on there, suddenly having that, you can experience a kind of like, I need to poke around this thing and figure out what do I actually get to decide and not get to decide, and when should I be responsible for something. That learning's really important, and it's important around kind of responsibility to each other and to have that agency. To tie that to the concept of sovereignty could be powerful if really well cared for and tended to, and could get kind of funky because it's like actually just some like individual terrain you have to learn, and connecting that to the learning about sovereignty might not do sovereignty kind of justice. So there's kind of two parts to it. There's like conceptual sense of how they bridge and move together over time, and there's partly just what does it mean for a bunch of people to have more freedom, and then what responsibility does that increased freedom have, and how do we hold each other accountable to it? And are those bounded and connected or intertwined, or useful to keep separate but all be talked about? So that was the gist of it.
No, I think that covered it. I think that we're hoping that the latter journey, the one that you're talking about starting with that sense of freedom and playing with it, and having exercising that muscle, so that we're all getting better at it in terms of agency and all of that. That's part of the journey towards digging deeper into sovereignty. And in the field of this program, sovereignty is linked to relationship in deep and profound ways. That sovereignty isn't separate from relationship. That my personal sovereignty does not make me accountable to the relationships in which I exist.
I'll just add that, at the beginning of this program, we often talk about the ecological principles that we're trying to embody and step into. And two of those that we name are differentiation and interdependence. And on some level, the practice of personal sovereignty, in my mind, is actually about holding both of those in relationship with each other and in tension with each other. That what I may need in a particular moment for my own well-being at times can actually cause an impact in the larger learning community that I'm part of. And being committed to the well-being of both at the same time requires a nuanced capacity for not just caring for myself, but also being in relationship with and having responsibility to note how caring for myself might impact the larger learning community that I'm part of. It's part of what Chandine keeps mentioning as running toward the center, to meet each other at the center. And I think part of this conversation is also an invitation for us to collectively explore how we can step into our own lived experience of personal sovereignty while being in deep, respectful, reciprocal relationship with each other, with the land, and beyond.
It's that being your most empowered self actually isn't about yourself. It's about your relationship in the space or wherever space you are. So when your most empowered self is actually tending to those relationships in those decisions you have to make all of the time. And it's a practice.
And one that I think we're interested in inviting all of us in.
And one that we're urging you to practice, both when we're together for all of the residencies and also in the online environment, that these practices are meant to be carried as a through line all the way through all of the work we're engaged with in this learning community.
Can I say one more thing? Just the invitation would be like to uncode it a little bit. How do you notice the habits you might have where your sense of what's for the self and your sense of what's in interrelationship, how you might track or pay attention to, like, I'm getting this need met right now, and I'll use this principle to be able to match up the thing that I have, but I'm actually not consciously practicing it. I'm just kind of pulling that part, or I'm trying it out. And how do I do a little, both give myself permission to do some experimenting and figure out, I actually need to bring a lot of creativity to this assignment, or show up to it in some very different way, or ask for what I need when I need help and I don't usually ask for help, or I'm going to break some rule that typically you don't do. And other times go like, it's my default would be to do it this way, but I haven't actually noticed the impact I'm having on everyone else, and I actually have to really call myself to account. And how might I note that in my journal, or when I'm doing the thing that I actually am bringing a lot of consciousness to it? Because I think it's the dance of that in the day-to-day, and in the way you get an assignment and it's like, do X, Y, or Z, and it's like, do I have permission to do this? And so it's there's some way about just trying to allow it to be kind of tangible. Yeah.
I find that interesting too on the flip side, and I'll use a concrete example for me in this community here, right? So practicing the muscle of being your own sovereign changes everywhere you go, because of the way in which you've been impacted in communities or where you've been. So when I'm in a particular setting, I know I can breathe because I can be my sovereign self in relation with the world around me. And in some place new, I don't always know that. So the concrete example, and then the strategy, if you will, that I'll use is there is a retreat that we're on for 4 days, and I needed to leave a half a day early for something important for my son. And I had already committed to these 4 days, and it was important to actually make time for these 4 days, and not knowing the community well enough to know I need to be my most empowered sovereign self, and I also need to be aware that it is going to impact the community. So I called someone from that community and I said, hey, work this through with me. I want to make sure that I'm tending in relationship to those around me. Work this out with me, please. And my friend lovingly working that out with me and saying, well, let's talk about it and let's see. And so it's like there's a continuum of it. There's a full side because we're shaped by practices that don't embody what it means to walk toward personal sovereignty all the time. And because of that, we question ourselves. So one thing that I do is talk to someone about it who's in that same community with me. It may not be what works for everybody, but it's something to consider in this relationship, in this program.
Especially talking to people that might be impacted by the choice that you're making in relationship to your own sovereignty. I think that's a really important piece, which is the part that keeps that tension between the differentiation and interdependence like working and remain dynamic and not become fixed towards differentiation, but your sovereignty is always in conversation with, in relationship with the impact it has on the whole.
So I think the flip side of, or a dynamic that can be in relationship to sovereignty is entitlement. And one of the things that I think can happen when we emphasize differentiation and lose track of our commitment to each other, to the larger communities of which we're part, is that sovereignty can begin actually showing up as an expression of entitlement. And that's one of the things we just want to name as a potential kind of shadow side of practicing sovereignty to just become aware of as we move forward.
I just want to say something about, I think entitlement may show up in terms, if I'm used to having a pretty large field of choices around me, the environment in which I live doesn't push back on me much. I'm in environments that kind of allow me to make my own choices in ways, or the social construction is in my favor, then the announcement of sovereignty or personal sovereignty and much larger freedom has the potential to kind of let me loose. Whereas if have had a very small field of choice and and I'm really trying to play with this, that muscle may feel really new and tender. And so when that tenderness of that newness hits up against the larger field of, oh, it's always, I get more freedom than I've always had, and I've always had a lot, that dynamic can create harm and impact within a community, within a learning community. So for me, the personal sovereignty piece and the entitlement piece work together in some ways that we want to try to pay attention to and avoid in our learning communities to try to decrease the harm or the impact on each other.